Today, the United States is the undisputed great power of the Americas, the dominant naval power in the world, standing tall as the most powerful nation on Earth. This American dominance becomes even more clear when we compare it to their former overlords in Britain. Britain once ruled a quarter of the world, but is now struggling to keep together even their small empire on the British Isles themselves. But this balance between the two is only quite recent. For a long time, the United States was on the periphery of the Western balance of power. Strong, but isolated. And in terms of naval and army capabilities, they couldn't directly compete with their only real close rival, the British. This meant that for the most part, apart from some minor conflicts, the British and the Americans remained on relatively good terms for the past century and a half. But there is one large conflict, apart from the American War for Independence, that saw Britain and America in direct conflict with each other. The War of 1812. The War of 1812 didn't have a real direct cause. The British pressing American civilians into their navy was the official reason, but the causes were many. The Americans had only recently gained independence, and the British didn't fully respect the new nation yet. The British were also weary of potential American desires to annex their colony in Canada, leading to the British supplying natives fighting the Americans in the Northwest as a potential future buffer state between the US and Canada. Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars were underway, leading to America imposing trade restrictions on first both France and Britain, and later just Britain. These many factors resulted in the Americans in 1812 declaring war on the British. The Americans began the war by attempting to invade British Canada, being repelled by Canadian militias and British expeditionaries. The American army was relatively small, and mostly made up of state militias who were unclear as to why they were fighting Canada, meaning the small American army had low morale. In comparison, the Canadians were fighting for their independence from America, meaning that they were fighting fiercely against the Americans, supported by some British regulars. After this initial American invasion was repelled, the initiative was put in British hands. The British had erected a large-scale blockade of the American coast, and then burned down Washington, before being repelled again from the north. The British then attempted to land at New Orleans in the south, only to again be repelled by the Americans. At this point, both sides saw little point in continuing the war. The peace deal has been described as a draw, but the Americans did come out ahead, since while there were few direct border changes between Britain and America, the Americans did take Western Florida from Spain, and the British ended their support for natives fighting against the Americans, leading to America removing the natives there with much more ease. But by all accounts, Britain should have been able to win this war. They largely had naval supremacy over the Americans, and a significantly larger army should they choose to send it over. So why didn't Britain do this? Well, there were two main reasons. The first is that there was little reason for Britain to invest significantly into the war against the Americans, as it's unclear what they could possibly stand to gain from it. The War of 1812 is sometimes called the Second War of American Independence, but this really wasn't the case from the British perspective. There was no idea of somehow re-annexing all of the US as a British colony. This would be a huge investment from Britain, which would likely only lead to renewed American resistance. For the British, the goal of the war was defending Canada, which they did. Continuing to fight America would give them little benefit. So apart from the minor expeditions into Washington and New Orleans, the British didn't do anything drastic to combat the Americans. But perhaps the bigger reason for Britain was British war exhaustion. With the goal of an American expedition unclear, why would Britain want to invest the monetary cost of invading America? It is important to remember that by this point, the British had been combating the French Revolution and Napoleon for about 20 years. Britain has been spending a lot of money subsidizing their allies on the European continent, as well as paying for their own fleet and armies fighting the French. This 20 years of large spending and war exhaustion left little enthusiastic for the costly and seemingly pointless expedition into America. But what if this changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Britain did decide to invest more heavily in the war in the Americas? How would history have changed if Britain had won the War of 1812? Now, how exactly we make this happen isn't interesting to me. Britain simply diverts enough resources away from Europe to win in North America. It is likely that the war still stalls between 1812 and 1814. Since it's still way more important to combat Napoleon than the Americans. But after Napoleon is initially defeated, it's time to show these upstart colonials what's up. After a couple of years of fighting, we would see the US militarily defeated, with perhaps most significantly Britain occupying cities like New Orleans, Washington or New York. What does the peace treaty look like? Well, we can go several routes here. The first is a mild outcome for the Americans, and it's also the result I consider the most likely. The British wanted to contain the Americans to protect their own holdings in the region. But by punishing the Americans harshly, the British would just be inviting more and more conflict in the future. The one clear goal that the British may have enforced on the Americans is the independence of the Tecumseh's Confederacy. These were the natives that Britain was supporting against the Americans in the Northwest Territories. They would become a semi-independent protectorate of the British, dealing a huge blow against American desires to expand westward. There was also a dispute over the border of where Maine should be. It is possible that the British solved this dispute in their favor, but much more territorial concessions after this point wouldn't be likely. Then we have the potential for a slightly stricter result. The Americans had recently acquired the formerly French Louisiana territory from Napoleon, pushing the American border significantly towards the west. It is possible, in the case of a total British domination in the war, that the British demand the return of the Louisiana territory to the Spanish, with the British gaining economic concessions in the region. The Spanish, in a limited capacity, fought against the Americans in Florida as well, and the current Spanish regime was put in power there by the British. By stripping the Louisiana territory as well as the Native Confederation away from the Americans, the US is suddenly extremely limited in their future expansion, reducing their potential as a future threat to Britain. There is, however, one big issue with this outcome: the weakness of Spain itself. Spain had been devastated by the Peninsular War during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had attempted to overthrow the Spanish monarchs and take control of Iberia himself, leading to most of the Spanish colonies descending into civil war and wars of independence. Let's say our alternate War of 1812 ends by around 1880. By around this point, the Spanish defeat in the Americas seems inevitable, which means that giving Spain the Louisiana territory back would be a risky move with unclear benefits. Wouldn't Spain just immediately lose the territory to a newly independent state? Now, another possibility would be returning the Louisiana territory to France instead of Spain, by arguing that while the Louisiana sale to America was illegal, it was legal for France to strip the territory of Spain in the first place. But since it was Napoleon which stripped Louisiana from the Spanish before selling it to the US, this seems quite hypocritical for the British to argue. The only somewhat realistic solution to the Louisiana issue is making the United States pay reparations to the Spanish, essentially making the Americans buy the Louisiana territory again, but from Spain this time. There would also be massive potential changes inside the US itself. There were two main parties inside the US at the time. The first are the Federalists, who sought a smaller but stronger and more centralized union, seeking good relations with Britain. Opposing them stood the Democratic Republicans, largely Southerners who sought to weaken the central government by preserving state rights and seeking to expand the Union further into the North, South and West. In our own timeline, the Federalist Party was already the weaker party by 1812, by which point they decided to heavily oppose the war against Britain. This peaked in 1814, when the New England Federalist Party held a convention where they discussed, among other things, potential New England secession from the Union, discrediting the war, and their issues with the Louisiana Purchase. In our timeline, this convention could have scarcely happened at a worse time, since only a couple of weeks after this convention, the Americans won against the British at New Orleans, effectively ending the Federalists as a political force, since they now were opposing the war which America was set to win. This could very well have been different in this alternate timeline. As the Federalists opposed the war the Americans were increasingly losing, they could have a political revival as the party that fought against this war with Britain. While the Democratic Republicans continued to fight this war, the Federalists would have been openly against the war and would have constantly attempted to steer for a peace deal to be reached. But, after the initial revival of the Federalist Party, during and shortly after the war, the fundamental issues holding them back would return. It is a simple fact that most of the population and the states of the Union at the time were Southerners, opposed to the fundamental ideals that the Federalists hold. It's difficult to see a scenario where the Federalists return to long-term dominance or prominence within the nation's political sphere. What is, however, quite likely is that America becomes more divided about Britain. The humiliating loss of 1812 would see a permanent crisis zone appear around the Great Lakes area. While Britain is now propping up a native confederacy in the area, there are still hundreds of thousands of Americans living in the area as well. There were no concrete plans as to how to deal with these Americans following the peace deal. Many may leave, but it's also quite likely most of them will remain in the region, providing constant tension between the Americans, the natives, and the British. It is quite likely that these constant tensions would continue to diminish American-British relations, as the American public cries out against perceived British injustices. Which is where we reach the inevitable conclusion of this scenario: the American local overmight on the American continent. Sure, Britain is by this point the most powerful single nation on Earth, but the nations surrounding America simply cannot compare. The Native Confederation couldn't even come close to rivaling the Americans, meaning that if British support for the Native Confederation ever wavers, the Americans could simply re-annex them. Canada, similarly, is still heavily dependent on Britain and reliant on local colonial militias and government. Without constant British protection, Canada has no hope against the Americans. Then finally, there is Mexico, which has an unstable government and is feeling the burden of American immigration into their northern states. And, as you can all guess, Mexico has no hope against the US without British aid. Over the first couple of decades after the peace deal, the status quo may survive. But as the world becomes a more volatile place, it's difficult to see America not pushing their local advantages over Britain. As long as America leaves Britain alone, is it really worth it for Britain to continue to prop up the Native Confederation? As the decades drag on, and Britain is forced to constantly carry the burden of the Native Confederation, wouldn't they just give up? Britain has a global empire and their North American possessions are simply not that important on the world stage. At least not important enough to keep fighting the Americans over. So here we reach the conclusion of this scenario. Especially during the second half of the 19th century, the US continues to drag a significant amount of migrants to the US, since the US has an insane amount of land to give out to the poor Europeans. Over time, much like in our timeline, the US population would start to spill outside of the borders on the map, moving into the Native Confederation and Mexico. These governments would simply be unable to stop the tide of American migrants. Unless Britain is willing to keep committing to costly wars with the Americans to defend these nations, eventually the US would win against them. As the inevitable becomes increasingly clear, it is likely that Britain and America enter into negotiations about the future of the North American continent. How these negotiations would go is impossible to say, but it's likely that they decide on the border disputes between Canada and the US, with in exchange for the British giving up on the Native Confederacy entirely, the British may gain the Columbia region. This is the map I consider the most likely at the end of this scenario. All in all, a pretty disappointing result for the British, but it simply seems unlikely that Britain is willing and able to put in the constant effort to keep the Americans down. The British focus would be on India, on the great game against the Russians, on getting economic concessions from the Chinese, etc. While Britain could, by all accounts, have continued to defeat the Americans militarily and navally, it simply wouldn't be worth it for them. As the American population grows, the British would need to constantly increase their involvement in keeping the Americans down, which they simply wouldn't be willing to do, as they weren't willing to do so in our own timeline. 1812, when the British decided to contain the Americans after the War of 1812, simply isn't the same time period as 1848, and British priorities will have drastically shifted. The only potential breaking point, and the final opportunity for Britain to finally stick it to the Americans, would be during the Civil War, assuming that it would still happen. If the British would choose to assist the Confederates in gaining independence, the map would obviously look drastically different. But if I'm going to be honest, for the same reason that Britain would not come to Mexico's aid, or to the aid of the natives, I don't think the British would support the Confederacy. It's still a war with a lot of risk and cost for the British, with unclear benefits apart from continuing to antagonize the US, meaning, again, more and more investment in keeping North America safe. Not to mention that supporting the Confederacy would be horribly hypocritical for the British, with the UK being the primary international abolitionist power. It wouldn't look internationally to publicly and militarily support the Confederates against the Union. So, after a tumultuous first half of the 19th century, Britain and America would have little reason to continue competing with each other. While for a while there would still be some bitter feelings from America towards the Brits, in the end, economic benefits and sheer pragmatism would win out in the US and Britain. Positive relations with the British gives the Americans the ability to remain internationally isolated, as no other power is in any position to challenge the Americans, while the British would still be the most important economy in the world at this time. Good relations between the two powers would be massively beneficial to both sides now that the most important territorial disputes have been solved. So this is where I'll end this scenario. I'm sorry for the lack of uploads the past 2 weeks, but I simply didn't have a voice, so I couldn't record any scenarios. If you like this video, consider liking and commenting, since it really does help the video grow against the algorithm. If you like this type of content, consider subscribing, since if I don't lose my voice again, I hope to release a new alternate history video every single Sunday, as I have been doing for the past half a year. I also want to give a massive shout out to my patrons who support me in making more and better content and allowing me to dedicate more time and effort into my videos rather than into work. The current patrons are on screen now, and if you want to support my content as well, you get added to this animation as well as gaining early access to videos whenever I complete them myself. Again, thank you all for watching and supporting me. I hope to see you next time, and goodbye.